please join in spirit. So thank you everybody for coming. Once again, if anybody does not want to be in the recording, please feel free to turn your camera off. And we will get started. So welcome to Let's Talk Ottawa. So you want to facilitate a dialogue. Today it's going to be a very practical session. There's going to be a lot of information. So we hopefully will be able to get to everything within the 2-hour limit. But a little bit about me to start. My name is Josh. I'm originally from Northern Ontario, but we moved to Ottawa when I was still in school, and I graduated school there, and then also university. But I've actually been living in the former Soviet Union for most of the past 10 years. So some of the main hats that I wear, I'm a freelance writer, and I'm also a researcher. I'm a very big hitchhiker. I use duct tape to fix everything, but I'm also a dialogue facilitator. And for me, that has meant doing work in North America. So through this Let's Talk Ottawa initiative is one way. So during COVID lockdown, I came back to Canada to do a master's in conflict studies at St. Paul. And during that, I was also running dialogues every week or every couple of weeks. And then also trainings on like conflict resolution and dialogue techniques and communication in general. And I'm really interested in kind of dialogue and peace building as a response to socio-political polarization. So divides between the left and the right. It's also about like COVID or about social issues. But I'm also actually very active with dialogue work over here with the war. So I was mostly based in Russia for the past number of years, but then I had to relocate to Georgia after the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. And here I'm also kind of helping to coordinate a community of Russian dialogue facilitators who are trying to use dialogue to respond to stuff in the face of the war. But also I work with Ukrainian colleagues as well who are doing the same thing from their side. So that's my background. In terms of Let's Talk Ottawa, so this lovely picture kind of cuts out both mine and Melanie's faces, but the three of us, myself, Melanie, and Rahil, we started Let's Talk Ottawa. Also, like Melanie and Rahil, they started it prior to COVID, but then I joined during COVID, and together we've done a number of different kinds of events. Again, kind of like focused on peace building, dialogue, and polarization. So we did a 4-part dialogue facilitation training in 2001. In 2022, I organized a dialogue in response to the convoy. And then following that, there was also a workshop on like peace building in the context of convoy conflicts. And so that's all recorded and on our Facebook page if you want to check that out. There was also a workshop on how to build peace while triggered. But that was a bit of a fail because I was super burned out and it wasn't as up to snuff as I normally like. So you won't find a recording of that anywhere, but we did it. And so for today, there are kind of like 4 components. The first one is just an introduction. So basically, when we're talking about dialogue, what is it that we're talking about, right? And just kind of set the stage and really kind of focus on, like what it is we're talking about, but what it is we're not talking about, because like people often use the word dialogue in a lot of different ways, and so I just want to kind of set it straight for today's session. And then we have kind of 3 parts, basically. So today is a very practical workshop. As a bit of background for today, so also, I don't know, I think it was a few months ago, Melanie, Rahil, and we were talking about kind of expanding at least our online group of people who are interested in Let's Talk Ottawa or dialogue in the city. So we invited some other folks into a group chat on WhatsApp. Some of the folks in that chat are here today. And we were thinking about, okay, like what kinds of things would we like to do? What do we find useful? And so one thing that people were asking for is kind of a training on dialogue facilitation. So that's how this workshop came to be today. And so we decided to open it up for a broader audience. So it's a very kind of crash course boot camp. If you want to facilitate a dialogue, what are the basic things you have to think about to organize it. So preparing for your dialogue, while you're actually doing the dialogue, and then like after the dialogue. So those of you who have actually facilitated dialogue, this might not be new. But for those of you who are interested in facilitation or haven't facilitated before, think about this as kind of like a menu or a checklist of things that you can think about in order to do it. And I'm really happy to be in touch afterwards if you decide to facilitate a dialogue, to hear like how did it go, what were some of the insights, or if you're an experienced facilitator, I'm also very happy to hear later about what else you might add. And so there should be some time, hopefully, for questions and discussion at the end. Normally when I do workshops, I like to kind of also have space for like exercises and like more discussion and stuff, because there's so much information today, there might be less time for that. There's a couple activities throughout, but we'll see if we can get to them. Okay, so any questions about the structure today and what we'll be doing? Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand if you have a question. No, not yet. Okay, good. Okay. So what is dialogue, right? So one of the cliche definitions that a lot of people kind of like use in the peace building world, it goes back to Norbert Roper's, who wrote a really good handbook for dialogue. It's the meaningful and meaning creating exchange of perceptions and opinions, which sounds really vague. It could almost kind of mean anything, but what I mean when we're talking about dialogue is kind of like a form of communication where we're kind of engaging with other people for the purposes of mutual understanding. So here it says like this is not a debate. So we're not trying to convince other people of what we believe. We're not trying to kind of, I don't know, lure them into a trap. We're not trying to manipulate them. Some of the different components of dialogue here, we're like sharing our own experiences. We're comparing the narratives that we have about a certain situation, especially if it's about a conflict. We're like in this kind of communication, we're building relationships. Maybe we're trying to reach consensus or try to like work on some kind of creative problem solving. But think about it, if there's like mediation and if there's like working on a specific problem, dialogue is the component of this conversation where we're learning about each other, learning about why we believe what we believe. Yeah, just kind of, especially in a context where it's in a conflict or if it's like polarized, um, we're learning to see each other as human again. And so this is dialogue is not something that's done in isolation from other activities, but often a lot of other activities like negotiation or like mediation, like debate, these are things that are often going to be improved if there's some kind of dialogue component ahead of time. So that's kind of the definition that we're talking about today. But there's also kind of like, I want to draw attention to two different ways that we can use the word dialogue. One is something we can do ourselves, right? So for me, I got my start with dialogue with hitchhiking, because I would spend 10 hours a day in a transport truck with some driver, and we would just talk about everything under the sun. And I realized we are getting to this like really kind of almost intimate like space of kind of connection and learning about each other. And that really also is kind of like dialogue, right? But it's something that happens between two people without any kind of outside intervention. But the second kind, which is what we're going to be talking about today, is like facilitated dialogue. So this is where a facilitator is kind of organizing the event and helping it move forward. And so think about it kind of like there's a facilitator and there's a circle of participants. And so that it could be like a few participants, like 4 or 5, but I've also facilitated dialogues with maybe like 20, 25 participants. And these could be either everyone comes with their own agenda, or they could be like equally kind of like different sides of a conflict. But we're going to be talking about facilitated dialogue today and this like more like intentional format. So a number of things that we're going to be talking about today can also be used with dialogue that's spontaneous, just between two people. But I'm thinking in particular about facilitated dialogue. Which is also good because some of the other workshops that I've done through Let's Talk Ottawa or Dome workshops or kitchen talks, a lot of them were kind of focused on like the techniques that we can use when we're having a conversation with somebody else. but it's been very rarely that we've done something specifically about facilitation. So yeah, very into doing this today. So there's where can we use dialogue, right? So dialogue can be used just for fun. So some of us were talking about the Kitchen Talks project. So this is something that's just we would meet once a week and once every 2 weeks, and we would discuss like a hot topic, and I would be facilitating the conversation. And there was no agenda. There was no nothing needed to be done. No decisions had to be made. It was just a space for people to come to learn from each other. And so that's also kind of like on one side of the scale of dialogue. I would, and then in the middle, we see like dialogue can also be used within particular communities to kind of like address a specific issue. So the Kitchen Talks Explore format, some of you were present for that. So basically, like there's a there's a topic that's like very kind of relevant to the community, and the structure is kind of more, it's less free flow. It's more specific. So for example, we had very specific dialogues on the vaccine, on Trump following the storming of the Capitol in 2021, also the convoy dialogue in 2022. It's kind of this like not completely structured, but at the same time, it's not just for fun either, right? And then we have dialogue that's actually used to address conflict. And so this is dialogue that's structured in a way that tries to actually have an impact on a conflict context. So, for example, there was one time that I was facilitating a dialogue in the Greater Forest Lawn / East Calgary neighborhood in Calgary, and so there was a conflict between the municipal government and like basically like people in a neighborhood that was quite low income, and so we would be facilitating dialogues like throughout the neighborhood at various community centers, and basically like the structure of how those dialogues were done, and I might get into this a little bit later, was done so that the concerns that were surfaced in the dialogue would also kind of like make their way up to dialogues that were being had on the municipal level. Also in Ukraine, a number of my colleagues are applying dialogue techniques to help displaced persons integrate into new communities that have been affected by the war. But also prior to the full-scale invasion, they were doing dialogues, including like between like government kind of like bodies or people to talk about like what new ministries should be doing, but also dialogue across the contact line. So people from government-controlled territory, non-government controlled territory. So dialogue can be from this like very informal to the very formal and very serious with lots of implications. So the kind of dialogue you'll facilitate might be very different in terms of where it is on the scale, but this is the range of what we're talking about. So again, okay, so this is a disclaimer. I kind of already talked about it. So today there's just so much information, and there's so much information about the topic. It was very hard to think about what can we put within like an hour and a half, 2 hours. So we're not going to get to everything under the sun. But again, it's kind of just food for thought. If you're thinking about facilitating your own dialogue, what are the things that you have to think about, and how you might go about that. So there's not going to be as much space for questions or discussion as usual. So sorry if it's going to be information overload. If we need to take a break, please signal and let me know. And because otherwise I might terminate it through the presentation. So that was the introduction. So now we have the three parts that we're going to be talking about. One is preparing for your dialogue. Two, what you're going to do during your dialogue. And three, what you're going to do after your dialogue. So preparing for the dialogue, this is quite an important quite an important aspect. And one of the first things that you need to think about is what's the goal of your session. So one possible goal is just to kind of create a space for open discussion without an agenda. So anybody can come, anybody can express themselves. There's also an important point here, what kind of rules you want to have for the open discussion, because in certain contexts, you're going to want your space to be like a safe space, maybe for a particular community, which means that you might be welcome to certain ideas or certain perspectives and less welcome for others. So there's going to be some dialogues that have a very clear set of values. And if those values are not respected, the participants are going to be asked to leave. But then you're going to have other kinds of dialogues where anybody can come with any opinion, or at least almost any opinion. Like usually there's lines about like racism, sexism, homophobia, other kinds of discrimination. But for example, I've seen dialogues where people have expressed like liberal views, conservative views, centrist views, and everything was welcome and everyone was learning from each other. But there are also other kinds of dialogues where, for example, it might be within um, a particular like political context. So it might be like a dialogue between like leftist activists about what to do about racial issues, right? And then not all values and not all opinions are going to be welcome. So it might be open discussion, but you have to figure out like again, like what kind of space you want to do you want to do that. Another goal is creating space for heat, which is just a way to say like there's a conflict in your community, and you want to create a space for people to come and express that, um, and that's going to involve a different kind of format and a different kind of structure to kind of contain the tension. So, for example, I'm gonna be talking a little bit later about how exactly I structure some of the different dialogues that I've had with this in mind, but the preparation is going to look differently, and then a dialogue that makes an impact. So again, for the first and the second categories, maybe all that you want to do is just have an impact on the participants who come, um, which is great. Other kinds of dialogue, they want to have a more of an impact on a conflict context. So, for example, my colleagues in Ukraine, also my colleagues in Russia, um, are not just doing dialogue for dialogue's sake, but are actually trying to engage through their dialogues to engage with the community on a very particular in a very particular way. There are also dialogues that have actually ended wars, and obviously there's that's a really big conversation, but there's some dialogues that have really also kind of like played a very key component in stopping mass violence. So, for example, in South Africa with the end of apartheid, in Mozambique with the civil war, in Colombia in 2016, which is quite recently. So it's like, and again, like depending on what your goal is, you're going to structure your process very, very differently. And again, we'll get into that in a second. Um, and another big thing is making sure your participants know what the goal is. So I did once a dialogue. So here in Tbilisi, for those of you who came in a little bit later, I'm living in Tbilisi, Georgia right now. So I was doing kitchen talks, which is like this open discussion style dialogue. And where our participants actually decided the topics every week. And so one week we wanted to talk about colonialism, and it was structured in a way that anybody could come and share their opinion. But there were some participants who came and were expecting an activist conversation, where imperialist opinions were denounced and not entertained. So we actually had a very heated encounter during the meeting itself because the goal wasn't made clear to the participants. And so certain participants may come and it may cause tension. And in the end, it ended with some of the participants walking out of the session. So especially if you're dealing with some kind of like hot topic, hot button issue, it's really important that people understand what the space is for and what it is not for. Especially if some people are expecting the space to be safe in a very particular way. And if that's not the kind of safe space that you're building, then it's really good for people to know as soon as possible, so they can decide for themselves how they want to participate. Okay. And then next, after you kind of think about your goal, you have to think about who you want to recruit, like who's going to be there for it. One style is whoever comes comes. So when I do these kitchen talks, often it's like I just started with like when I started doing them in Ottawa, I just started on Facebook. I would just like create an event on Facebook, And then I would just post it and I would invite like my friends and they would come, but then they would invite their friends. And then we created like this email list through Eventbrite. And a number of you have kind of participated in that way. And then just kind of like grew naturally from there. But there wasn't any agenda for who should be there or who should not be there. The second is people who either know about or who are impacted by the issue. So you can invite people, particularly who are from communities affected by a particular kind of conflict, um, as well as people who might just kind of like come for the sake of kind of participating or seeing. But this is usually this kind of more selective aspect. This is something that might be there when you're dealing with a conflict or with a very particular kind of issue. So, for example, maybe you're doing it within a very particular community. So, Rahil, who is one of our founding members, he was interested in doing dialogues within like the Indian community to kind of talk about some of the tensions that were there with the Indian community in Canada. When I was doing the dialogue in Calgary between the city and like involving the city government and the neighborhood, we were doing dialogues that were geographically based. So we picked four community centers, and we basically had like one dialogue in each of these community centers, and one of it was like a church or a religious center. And so we would actually be inviting people through the network of those community centers to come and to share their experience of engaging with the city. So it was other people from other parts of the city could come kind of as guests and also as observers and as participants in that way. But because of where we organize the dialogue, that would impact who would actually be there. Also, it's important here to think about whether your dialogue is online or offline. So during COVID, we did online dialogues, and so eventually we had people also participating from like Europe or from Brazil, and that was really cool too. But when we did the convoy dialogue, we really wanted to recruit, especially from Ottawa, although there are people from other parts of Canada. And then there's planned recruitment, where you carefully select participants, where you have to have like particular people who are there, either from like specifically like impacted communities. So, for example, a dialogue between displaced person, residents in the host communities where they live, and then representatives of local government, right? So, if somebody isn't part of one of those three categories, it might not make sense for them to be there. Or if you have more of a classic conflict related dialogue, then you might have like half the people from one side and half the people from the other side. And then it's not open participation, like it's not an open invitation for anyone who wants to come. It's like for very specific people who receive that invitation. There's also a kind of dialogue called track two. We're not going to get into that super today, but this is the kind where it's like often like kind of influential people are invited to the dialogue who might have the ear of policymakers. So this is the kind of dialogue that people hope contributes to like ending war, right? So like in South Africa, they invited like academics, business people, relatives of high-ranking politicians to a dialogue recruited both from the white and the Black South African communities to create kind of like informal discussions that then eventually led to official negotiations that then ended apartheid. So again, like these are all very different. It's like your recruitment is like your recruitment style is going to be very dependent on what you want to do and what the goal is. Another thing too. So another way to prepare is especially if there's kind of this dialogue for like open conversation about like different topics. Like maybe if not everybody knows too much about the topic, then like you can give them something to read ahead of time. So for kitchen talks, usually in the announcements, I usually send them like some links to some articles about the issue, and then people can read up on it. And yeah, this is actually also really useful because um, when I was in when I was living in St. Petersburg in Russia, and I was doing kitchen talks every week, we wanted to make sure that not everybody who was coming to the topics were activists, because we'd often talk about like, I don't know, like imperialism or feminism or different kind of social issues, but we wanted to have a wide range of opinions expressed. And so we would actually market the dialogue also as a place to practice English. And so people who were not interested in activism, people who were not interested in the topic, they would come just to practice, and they would bring opinions that were kind of more like just of regular folks. right? And so they might not be as aware of the different dilemmas with the issue. And so, like, I would send like between 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 articles, kind of as an introduction to the topic, so that people, even if they aren't really involved in the issue, they can still kind of learn something about it and contribute to the discussion. So, giving people materials to read before the session, that can also be really good. And then, okay, so this is important, preparing people to talk. So, as a facilitator, your job is not to be speaking the whole time, like I am today, but to kind of help create an environment in the circle where people are inspired to talk and to share among themselves, right? So, there are kind of different things that you can do to prepare that for this. So first, normally I prepare my opener. People often kind of like today, people say their names, what brought them there tonight, and what particular issues and questions feel relevant to them. Um, and while they're speaking, I'm taking notes. So this might take like 10, 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 10 minutes if there's not too many people. And as people are saying, okay, so let's say if we are talking about nationalism, right? So what are the different questions about nationalism that are important to them? So I'm writing it in my notebook. But prior to the meeting, I'm also trying to predict what issues might be of interest for people to talk to. And because, so for example, for the Kitchen Talks format, I'm trying to lean into the dilemmas and lean into the potential conflicts and the differences of opinion. So I'm trying to think of questions to ask people that try to kind of dig dig into those disagreements and create space for us to talk about them, while also having a safe space, right? So I might have a list of something like 20 questions that I write in my notebook before the event actually starts. And I'll show you some examples in a second. But during this opener session, where people are going around in the circle and saying what aspects of the issue are interesting for them, I'm checking with my list of questions that I've already written to see, oh, like maybe they're all like talking about something else entirely, or maybe some of the questions that I wrote down are relevant. So I'll be kind of crossing off questions that aren't relevant for the group. I'll be circling questions that are particularly relevant, yeah, so that I can kind of facilitate in a more relevant way. And it's also a bit of a break for you if you're the facilitator and they have this round of introductions. Then it's also kind of a space for you to kind of like take a step back and kind of get a sense of the room and what people might be ready to talk about. So example questions for prep on nationalism that I might have. So these are 6 questions, but I usually have something like 15 or 20. So for example, what does the word mean to you, right? Is there a difference between good or bad nationalisms? And what would that be? So nationalism is often about identity. And so if somebody isn't really into nationalism as an identity builder, what else should we root our identities in? So for example, for me, I'm not like super I'm not super like into like my Canadian identity, but maybe I have other identities that I think are really important to me. And then also like what needs does nationalism meet, right? Nationalism is often, at least in my circles, kind of portrayed as this negative thing. But are there like very legitimate needs that nationalism meets? And if we don't like nationalism, are there other ways that we can meet those needs? Then this question, can we have national pride without national supremacy? Um, and I like this last one. When do you feel your national identity most activated? So I don't walk around thinking, oh, I'm Canadian, I'm Canadian. But there might be certain circumstances where I start thinking to myself more as Canadian, right? Or maybe like I'm from Northern Ontario. There'll be some cases where I feel more Canadian and some cases where I feel more Northern Ontarian, right? So one thing with all of these questions is that they're what we call open questions. So a closed question is something that can be answered with a yes or a no. And this is the kind of question that we don't want to be asking near the beginning, because like our job is kind of like to, I don't know, we're kind of like dandelions. Like we want to release the seeds, you know, like so they fly up in the air and they kind of continue and live their life of their own. We don't, we want to ask questions that create space for people to dig deep into something, right? if we ask questions that can be answered with like a yes or a no, then we're not, it's not really helpful, right? Because people can just say yes or no, and that doesn't really go anywhere. For me, I love the moment as a facilitator where I stop asking questions and the participants start asking questions of each other. And the conversation kind of like takes a life of its own and it goes around like that. And so for me, I try to like minimize the time that where I'm kind of taking the lead role in asking the questions and then when the participants are themselves. So this is an example of like some questions that I might that I might prep for that. Also, there you might want to prep exercises for for the dialogue. So, for example, one exercise that I really like is called the spectrum, and it's a physical exercise. So everybody stands up, and think about one side of the wall is like 100% I agree, and the other side of the room at the other wall is 0% I disagree. And you ask a question, and people can position themselves in the room depending on like where they how they feel about the question. So maybe they're in the middle, maybe they're like at 70%, maybe they're at 20%. And so for here, for example, how warm do you feel about your national identity? And then everybody might stand in a particular place in the room. And this is great because it's a way for everyone to express their opinions, even if they're not saying something, because not everybody is comfortable with talking, right? So these kinds of physical exercises can be really effective ways of getting everyone to share their opinion at once. And during COVID, I would kind of replicate this on a Google Doc where you'd kind of have like a spreadsheet with like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%, and then everybody can kind of put their name under their percentage. So it's also something that can be replicated online. Four corners is another physical exercise where each corner of the room represents a different answer to a question. So yes, no, maybe, or I don't know, right? And so again, it's a way to kind of like share what it is that you think about an issue. So for example, a question about nationalism might be, is culture something that should be actively protected? And then everybody kind of divides off physically into like these little groups. And then we can start asking follow-up questions like who should protect it? How should it be protected? Maybe the physical exercise is something else like, I don't know, um, like um, when we talk about a conflict, you might think like, who's the person who's responsible for this conflict? And then you give some answers and people can go to different parts of the room depending on their answer, right? Or maybe you can ask different questions and people are moving around the room depending on what their answer is, right? And if you do, and sometimes we form small groups with the people who answer similar to what we do. But sometimes we also form groups with people from different groups so that every single group is a bit diverse. So these are all, so the, when you're, especially when you're planning like an open dialogue, planning the kinds of questions and planning the exercises is really important. And it's really going to be like the backbone of the dialogue that you're going to facilitate. So this is my notebook where I write my questions. So come prepared. I have very small, very terrible handwriting. These are also my grocery lists. Um, but I would, it's actually right here. I always walk around with my little notebook like this. So there's lots of fossils of dialogue past in that. But it's usually really good to always have some kind of paper on you to be taking notes. So maybe let's take a pause. Are there any questions about kind of what we just talked about so far? Is this kind of information overload? How are people doing? Thumbs up, something like that. Excellent. Okay, great. So we will continue then. So now I want to talk about structuring dialogues that are a little more intentional. So in the for the past couple examples are kind of like from like a more of an open like free flow dialogue on like a controversial topic. But then when we have a topic that's actually kind of a source of conflict within the community, and you expect that people are coming with really strong opinions and are not going to want to listen to each other, the structure of the dialogue might have to be done in a way that kind of more tightly controls the dynamics in the room, just because there's so much emotion, and there's so much passion, while also still allowing for exchange and to learn about each other. So I'm going to give an example of a dialogue that I facilitated about Trump following the storming of the Capitol, and this was an online dialogue. So there were four main components of the evening. The first was, again, introductions, people talking about themselves and why this is important for them. But then and then we basically tried to divide ourselves into groups depending on how much we like or how much we don't like Trump. And we divided ourselves into four groups of like 4 or 5 people each. And the first time, and then we took time away to work in small groups and with the people who think like us. And in these groups, people come up with a few reasons about why they chose that group. So it was a way to try to help other people understand our reasons for believing what we do, as a way to challenge the stereotypes that they have about why we believe what we believe. So then we came back to we thought about the reasons about why we believe what we believe. Then we came into the large group, and then we listened, and then we went back to our small groups. And then every group designed a question for every single other group. So there are 4 groups. So one group would design 3 questions for each of the 3 other groups, and would ask them. So first we hear about why we believe what we believe. Then we ask a question. And then once we asked those questions, we went back to those groups again and figured out some answers. And then we came back to describe and discuss it. So it wasn't a free flow conversation, but it was more directed. And also as a way to try to create points of contact between people who believed very different things and who might be too angry to have a more casual conversation with each other. So that was one example of one kind of structure. Another one was our dialogue on the convoy. So this was a protest of truck drivers who were protesting certain COVID restrictions, and they came into Ottawa, as many of us know, and they kind of set up shop for about 3.5 weeks or so. And it had an impact on city life, and it was quite controversial. And so we did a dialogue on that. So there were 5 kind of components to this dialogue. So the first, again, like this, like, why did I come here today? Like this icebreaker. But then the second part, and because emotions were so high with this, because there was a bit of a blockade. Some businesses weren't able to run. Some people were like really relieved that the truckers were like protesting this way. Some people were really angry that the truckers were there. So when emotions are running really, really, really high, one of the things that we want to do is to rehumanize the situation, because it was really easy to dehumanize the other side. So the first activity that we did was, how have COVID-19 restrictions affected my life? And this is a kind of question that doesn't divide us into groups. So with the Trump group, we divided into groups immediately, right? Because we wanted to learn from each other. But we start here, not in a group, not divided into groups, but united in this way, where everybody is just talking about their personal experience of how COVID restrictions affected them. And this actually took a long time. So maybe even the first half of the dialogue was just, why did I come today and how did COVID affect my life? This was like a 2-hour session. But it was so important to get this down. There were maybe like 30 participants. I'm not sure, maybe some people here at this meeting also participated, but we took a long time to do this. And this was like it was such a necessary foundation of everything else, because it gave us a context of the stakes of why people did what they did. The next activity was, what fears, concerns, or frustrations do I have about the convoy or how it's been received? What are people in my camp doing that is contributing to the problem? And then what's one thing that the other side could say or do that would build trust or give me more hope? So in each of these questions, like, they were designed so that we kind of like go deeper into the issue, but also try to challenge some of the assumptions or some of the like us versus them dynamics. So for example, the what fears, concerns, or frustrations do I have? It's about like why am I angry? You know? And it's not about what are the other side doing that's wrong, but what are my fears? So I'm speaking from my own personal experience. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And then when we do kind of criticize, people are invited to criticize people in their own camps. And this also kind of shows the other side that we're able to think critically about ourselves. And this also creates more space for conversation. And then when we do talk about the other side, it's what can they do or say that would give me hope? So again, it's like for these last two questions here, it's the the questions and exercises are designed to open up space for collaboration and for connection and for challenging stereotypes. Also, this was a kind of dialogue that one of the goals was to have an impact. So at the same time, we were like I was taking notes as I was facilitating, and we created kind of a report that kind of visualized the different responses, and we created like social media content out of this. And so for this, what's one thing the other side could say or do? It basically we also kind of ended up creating a list of things that if I support the truckers and the convoy, or if I don't support the convoy, what are things that I can do to help the other side have more faith in me? So there's also this kind of practical element of that. So these are just different ways that dialogue can be designed. And again, the design is going to be very dependent on your goal, who you want at the table, and like what you want the dialogue to do.
Yes.
So how much time do we have? Are we okay? Yeah. So I just wanted to do some practice. So I hear I'm not in Canada, but I hear that the carbon tax is a bit of a hot topic on social media these days. Uh, so I wanted us to try kind of so if we think back to like preparing open questions, questions that create more space for engagement rather than like superficial space for engagement. I'd like us just to kind of like practice maybe wait. Uh, no, sorry. I'd like us to practice just maybe thinking up some open questions for this. So like think about so you can unmute your microphones and thinking about the impact carbon tax has on you, impact on others, whether it's like this kind of culture war issue, whether it's tied up to other issues, like kind of things like this. So if you are facilitating a conversation on the carbon tax, what might be some open questions that you might want to ask your participants to create a lively conversation? And feel free to be creative. Maybe we can get like two or three examples of questions. And one of the skills of a facilitator is to come up with questions on the spot, because as the conversation is going, you want to be kind of following the conversation and like asking the question that's going to like kind of spark the next nice conversation or the next nice kind of like movement in the conversation that you're having. So what might be some open questions that you might ask the room about carbon tax? And you can raise your hand or you can just unmute yourself and speak. Kristen.
Maybe I'm just kind of riffing off some other examples you shared, but like, how has the carbon tax affected my life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And this is also it's also good. Like one thing I might add here is like how do I fear the carbon tax might impact my life? Because like from the little that I've kind of seen on social media, the memes that are going back and forth, it seems like there's like it hasn't been rolled out yet, but there are a lot of people who are like afraid of certain things, right? So it could also kind of like what are the concerns that I have about that? Great.
Mhm.
What might be some other open questions about this? One open question I might ask is, why is this task like, why is this tax so resonant? Like, why are we fighting about this tax and not about other taxes? Because for me, when I think about the response to this, it seems like, I don't know if this is true, but my impression is that when people are fighting about carbon tax, they're actually fighting about something else. Um, like there's some other concern, whether it's like being upset with the government or being upset with Trudeau or being pro-environment. Like there's so many like different cultural issues that seem to be tied up in this. So for me, I would ask a question that tries to draw attention to these background issues. So like why are we angry about this tax and not another tax?
I'd be curious too, like, what are the implications for you and your family in regards to this carbon tax? And I think
Yeah,
it'll get to the root of the issue too.
yeah. Thanks, Lisa. Maybe one more example of an open question.
There's a suggestion in the chat box.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not able to super read the text. What assumptions am I making about the tax? Yeah, that's really good. Thanks, Charlotte. So in my dream dialogue facilitation course, like everything we just talked about would be its own session, and then the homework would be like make a list of like 15 open questions for your topic of choice, right? Well, we don't have time for that, but this is just kind of like this is really one of the like skills, especially for leading like the open conversations. So let's move on. Are there any questions about the preparation phase of the dialogue?
So for this carbon tax conversation, what would your goal be primarily?
So
When
for
you're
me, like like I would probably do like a regular kind of like open kitchen talks about it. So just kind of like a space for people to come and like share their opinions. But that's because like I don't have a lot of people in my community who like are like really up in arms about it, you know? But there's we were looking for funding a few years ago for like um, a more kind of concrete project in Ottawa, where we would actually like do this specially invited like conflict related dialogue. And then, for example, there are like I follow certain like if you get, do you guys know Telegram? It's like kind of like WhatsApp, but it's different. There are a lot of like kind of groups on Telegram that are kind of more populist. They're kind of more like anti-government, anti-establishment. And in these chats, there's lots of memes and there's lots of discussion and like anger about carbon tax, and some of them are Ottawa based. And so, like, if I wanted to reach out to these communities to have like a dialogue, then the inviting those communities would mean that the dialogue would be different. So if I just wanted to like invite my friends for like on Facebook to like a regular kitchen talks style dialogue, then like it would just be like open conversation. But if I wanted to engage like certain more like populist or anti-establishment communities, then they would have to be more serious. Like it would be kind of more like the Trump or the convoy structure, because people are very angry and very invested. Um, so like yeah, does that answer your question, Lisa?
it does.
Okay, perfect. Again, like the goal is basically what you want, right? And for me, the main one of the main factors that'll decide like what my goal is going to be is basically how hot is the issue, like how hot is it, and do I want the dialogue to do something beyond the boundaries of the dialogue? So, for example, the for the convoy dialogue, one of the goals was to create a report afterwards and to create social media content that could be shareable, and that could kind of maybe create some engagement. And actually, the report from this from the convoy from the convoy dialogue actually is what's kind of got me involved with Ottawa Dialogue later, which is like Lena was saying, like an institute associated with Ottawa University. Okay. So, oh, and then also in terms of the structure, if you also want to be having an impact, you can also design multiple dialogues that interact with each other. So, for example, for the Calgary project, we had kind of one tier of dialogues that were just kind of like open, like spontaneous. Anyone could come, but kind of based in these community centers, like just like not super structured. We would just like ask people to like say like what's your experience with the city like, and we'd have a conversation kind of coming out of that. But after like 4 dialogues, we started kind of like putting together. Okay, so here are like I don't know like 6 or 7 issues that keep on reemerging. So we might have a specific dialogue on that issue, and then we might invite people from the municipality, people from those like community dialogues that like specifically talked about their community experience of that. We might also include experts. We had like one dialogue on early childhood education, because that was brought up by like some like young parents in the community dialogues. And so then we brought like folks from the municipality, but we also brought in some like early childhood experts, and we kind of had a dialogue specifically with like those kinds of people. And a result of that dialogue was actually kind of like programming that kind of came out of that. And so again, like if your goals have an impact on the community, then like the structure is going to be very, very specific, and multiple dialogues can feed into each other in that way. Okay.
Hello.
Mangalam, could you turn off your microphone?
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
Turn off her microphone. Okay. So yeah, I think the biggest portion that we wanted to talk about today was this kind of before the dialogue. But during the dialogue, this is like, I don't know, I feel like 90% of dialogue facilitation trainings is all about this. So like, what are the techniques that you can use? Like, how can you facilitate? Um, there's too much here to talk about. So I just want to talk very, very briefly about 3 simple techniques that you can use to help guide the conversation and to deal with conflicts, or to deal with tension, or to deal with like some other stuff. We don't have time to practice all 3 of these. Normally what I like to do is I like to have one workshop about one technique. So in the past, we've done workshops on like narratives and like working with narratives. Another workshop was about like nonviolent communication and active listening. Like today, again, it's just like a very, very overview of like different things that you can kind of do. And like I can send some resources after the session if you're interested. So the three points of things that you can do as a facilitator to help enrichen the experience after you've done the design, after you've done the questions, after people are starting to talk to each other. People are going to get heated. People are going to go off on tangents. People are going to, I don't know, like one thing that's really always funny is people are going to be very passionate and talk about something, but what they're actually passionate about is something else that they're not talking about. And so as a facilitator, like you're working with these tensions and with this dynamic. And so 3 kind of pointers that I would want to bring up is returning to people's personal experience. When I say loop things back, this is like what some people call active listening. So reflecting back to people what they're saying to confirm for understanding. And then what I lovingly call the art of interruption, especially when people are talking are taking a lot of space, and maybe taking up much more space than other people. Returning to personal experience, this is especially true when people, especially in a conflict, when people start going off on tangents and talking about like, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, like this theory is true, and talking about facts and talking about beliefs. And these are all things that are very arguable. You know what I mean? And people can like start getting on fights, like, no, like this is right, no, this is right. But if you want to kind of bring it more into a dialogue space, because at this when you argue about like facts, it's debate, right? And everyone can basically like throw evidence at each other, and like nobody's going to be convinced. But what the dialogue space does really well is, again, like reintroduces this human element. So returning to the personal experience of how people are affected by something like opens up new space for a kind of conversation. So somebody says the carbon tax is bullshit. Okay, that's an opinion, right? But like you can say, okay, so what's changed for the people you know? And this is actually something I think somebody already suggested earlier when we were talking about open questions, right? Like, okay, so maybe it sounds like bullshit, but like, what does it mean to you, like on the ground, right? Or maybe somebody says we need to protect Ukraine to protect democracy, and this is like a very broad, like, and I support Ukraine, so I'm not against like pro-Ukrainian sentiment, right? But it's just like a very abstract, like, what does that mean? Like it can mean so many different things, and it's almost like I feel like I don't sense the person behind a statement like this, right? Like it could be something that a politician could say, or something that somebody heard and repeats, right? So I'm like, okay, so how do you feel when you watch the news about Ukraine? Because I want to understand, like, what are the stakes involved for this particular person, especially if they're living in Canada, maybe they have Ukrainian descent, right? Or maybe they don't, and they're concerned for other reasons. So we have the American election coming up, and so you'll often have people saying that like either Trump or either Biden, like who we think are going to be the ones who are going to be in the race, right, is going to destroy the country. Right? Okay, so then bringing it back down, how do you feel about the near future? What are the concerns that you have? How is this impacting you personally? And this kind of gets us out of a trap where we stop arguing about things and just speak about our personal experience, because you can't you can't argue with somebody's personal experience, right? Like you can, but it's a lot harder, right? And so if there's tension that comes from debate and I don't know, like challenging different people's facts, returning to people's experience can de-escalate that tension, especially because we start seeing the other person from a more like from multiple points of view, right? And it's like, oh, like this person isn't just like a stupid like XYZ. This is a person who has like a context, who's like personally affected by this conflict, and then that opens up more space for me to like to contact, to come into contact with them. It also helps with exposing the human impact of an issue, like I said, but it's really good because like maybe there's a lot of participants, especially with a controversial issue, that have blind spots. Maybe I'm so concerned with like, I don't know, the one like with the things that I'm concerned about with like the vaccines, right? Like the COVID vaccine. And I don't even, other concerns aren't even on my radar. When somebody speaks about their personal experience, maybe now that thing will be on my radar and I'll understand, oh, so that's why people are reacting in this way. I didn't understand that before, but now I do. So this is like, for me, if there's only one technique that you can come away with, it's like return to personal experience. Great. Thank you for sharing. How is this affecting you personally? This way of speaking about it might be unfamiliar with people. So as a facilitator, you might have to repeat the question a few times, or you may need to model it first, because not all participants are going to know how to speak from personal experience. They might kind of say, oh, I'm impacted like this because the politicians are stupid, la, 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 la. And they might start making judgments again, right? And then you say, okay, so like, how is that impacting you? You bring it back, you ground it. Like, what does that feel like? What sensation do you have in your body, right? Does it remind you of something? What emotions do you experience? So there's different ways of getting around to this, but it's like this kind of category of uh, of technique is really, really, really important. The second technique I want to talk about is looping things back, active listening. So saying things like I don't know, do I understand correctly that you believe this because of this, right? Or what I'm hearing you say is this. Does that sound right? And the important thing here is repeating back as clearly as possible without judgment what you hear, and then asking for confirmation. This is especially true if somebody's making like a really big kind of monologue or statement, or if somebody's like really emotional, and you say what you think they're saying, like succinctly, ask for confirmation. And if you get it right, sometimes you just see this like kind of tension release from their shoulders. And so that's also something that de-escalates tension in the room, you know? But also you can clarify what a conflict or what a statement is really about. Again, because if I say that like, I don't know, Trump or Biden are stupid, like that's a judgment, but that could mean that I'm concerned about like 100 different things in the back of my head, right? So you're trying to elicit from them what it is that they're concerned about, and then bringing it more explicitly into the room can help us have a more concrete, productive conversation. So for example, yeah, so like carbon tax is bullshit. Are you worried about your cost of living going up? Yeah, I'm working 2 jobs and I can't take it anymore, right? And so like maybe somebody is an environmental activist, and when they hear like carbon tax is bullshit, they just think, oh, like I don't know, this person's not educated, this person's like backward, this person is conservative, XYZ. But then you say, oh, like, are you worried about your cost of living? And it's like, oh, this person is working 2 jobs and they're afraid that certain costs are going to go up and like they're barely making ends meet. So this isn't like just a conversation about like what your political views are, but about economic precarity, right? Um, so, and then like we need to protect Ukraine to protect democracy. I'm thinking, oh, like maybe they think that small countries should be defended against big countries. So this is what I think I'm hearing, and so, but I'll ask to confirm it. So I'm hearing a desire to protect small countries and big ones. Does that sound right? And they're like, oh, no, because if Ukraine falls, we might have a nuclear war. So they're worried about escalation. So again, when we're trying to loop back what people are asking, we want to give them like an opportunity to confirm, and we want to be open to them correcting us. And then if they do correct us, we can repeat again what we heard, so that they're satisfied with what it is that we're saying, right? And then like by using this technique to kind of get down to what it is that people are actually saying, we can get to the core of our disagreements much faster. Yeah, wonders happen in the room when people feel like they're actually seen and they're actually heard. And then the last technique, the art of interruption. So imagine that in our conversation about nationalism, somebody stands up and has this like 5-minute monologue about how awful nationalism is and how awful nationalists are and how this is not the thing we need to do and blah, blah, blah. As a facilitator, they're taking up all the air in the room, right? So what you want to do is to affirm what it is that they say, kind of summarize what they say, kind of similar to this like active listening, and then turn what it is that they say into a question and ask somebody else, so that you acknowledge the value of what they say, take something good from it, and then ask it to someone else so that other people can also participate. So for example, in the like in the example here, it's like, what I like about what you're saying is there could be really negative impacts to nationalism. And then like, what do you think about these drawbacks? And hopefully the person takes the hint and lets other people also take the room, right? But the important thing here is, even though you're interrupting, you want to affirm the value of what that person says, both by saying something like, oh, I really agree with this, but then asking somebody else a question based on the content of what they said is also a way to show them their input is valuable. But that also you want other people to speak. You can do this kind of just like, oh, thank you for speaking, but we want another person to talk. But that can kind of like be, I don't know, some people take that not so very well, right? And so by kind of transforming what it is that they say into a question for someone else might be a bit more of a graceful way of doing it. So these are three simple dialogue techniques that I'm looking at the time, that we do not have time to practice today. But if you're interested in more, I can send some resources after the session. But they're pretty like easy to remember and also easy to use, and they help us leave a kind of more debate space and enter more of a dialogue space. And again, this is kind of like, these are the spontaneous things that you have to do like while facilitating a conversation. And this is kind of like the magic of facilitation, you know, like it's before you have your preparation, you have your open questions, you have your structure, like that's your skeleton. But these kinds of techniques are like the muscles and the blood of the experience. And this is something that you just learn over practice, right? So when I started doing kitchen talks, I didn't have any training. I just had led some like conversations previous to that, but I got better as I went along. And after the first year of doing kitchen talks, I went to this summer school on dialogue where like I met Sabina, and I learned more techniques. right? So a number of the techniques I've actually like a couple of them that I've described to you today, I actually learned like, I don't know, five years ago in Norway, right? So the more we go along, the more comfortable we are with certain kinds of techniques. Yeah, like we just grow over time. So that is some things that we can do during the session to kind of have a richer dialogue. And now I want to talk about what we want to do after the dialogue is done. And there are a couple things that are good that we can think about. Again, I want to go through these quickly because we have half an hour left, and I want to leave some time for questions and discussion. But again, what you want to do after the dialogue is going to be really dependent on what the goal of the dialogue is. First, congratulations. You facilitated a dialogue. Celebrate, recover. Sometimes after a dialogue, I'm just like so exhausted. Sometimes I'm just like super energized, but like I think that just taking a step to kind of recognize what you've done is really fantastic. Another thing that you can think about is, do you want to document your dialogue in some way, shape, or form? This can be done through kind of like content that can be shared, like kind of social media content, or it could be like a summary that you post somewhere. So I'm going to show an example of what this can look like. So okay, so this is the report that we had from our Freedom Convoy dialogue. So in this report, this is like very informal. It's just like on my website, like the description of the event, the principles and the ground rules of the dialogue, who was there, how many people, but then the different activities. So why did I come today? Like basically everything I showed you before, like how have COVID restrictions affected my life? What are people in my camp doing that's contributing to the problem? And then here are all the different reasons that why people came to the dialogue. And then the next section is how COVID restrictions impacted their life. But then later, it's like, what are the fears and frustrations about or concerns about the protests? So there was a category of concerns about the protesters. There was a category on the other side concerned about the like counter protesters and the response to the protests, and then the middle general concerns. So I was like documenting what was being said throughout the dialogue, and then kind of like creating yeah, just basically a document that tries to kind of like take the essence of what it was that we talked about. And then like we took this and we adapted it and created social media content out of this that we shared after the so we had this report, but then we also had the social media content, which was more kind of shareable. And then here it's like, what are things in my camp? What are the things that are happening in my camp that people are doing like well or not so well? So like pro convoy and anti convoy camp. And then this last one, which I really liked, is what's one thing that the other side could say or do that would build trust or give me hope? So things that the convoy and protesters could do, things that the counter protesters could do, and things both sides could do. And what I really love about this is, on one hand, it was like a very dialogue-y exercise. But what's produced after this is basically like concrete steps. So if somebody wants to de-escalate tension, or if somebody wants to reach out to the other side, like creating content like this gives people ideas of how to do that, right? So that's one example of content. So while I was studying at St. Paul and I was like living in Canada during lockdown and doing kitchen talks once every 2 weeks, I basically prepare like a small kind of like piece of content or a small report from every dialogue, kind of just leaving a paper trail. But then there are often kind of reports that are more formal. So we did like we basically wrote an academic paper after the Calgary dialogue with the city and the neighborhood. And this report, it's like a case study that we submitted to like an academic journal, so that other people who are like interested in taking these peace building techniques and applying it to municipal stuff, like know what we did and what worked and what didn't work and things like that. And so that's more formal. Often, if you're getting money from some kind of organization, they're going to want some kind of documentation afterwards as well. So that's also kind of like a more formal thing. Or maybe you don't want to do anything, right? Maybe the dialogue was the dialogue and that was it. But the kind of documentation is going to depend on, again, what was the purpose of the dialogue, and if there's like any donor who has a stake in what's involved. A really important thing is transfer. Transfer is basically the process. If you want your dialogue to have an impact in the broader community, transfer is the way that does that, right? So there's different mechanisms of transfer. So for example, if you're working in I don't know, I have some colleagues, the people who organized our summer school, they worked in Bosnia and in other countries in the Balkans after the war. And they worked in divided communities where different ethnicities lived in one town, and they wanted to build bridges between the ethnicities. So like, I don't know, create more communication between them, create more like joint school programs, things like this. So maybe transfer is like you just have so many dialogues that like enough people have been through the dialogue that like change happens in the community. Or maybe you involve key people in your dialogue. So like school teachers, journalists, municipal deputies, stuff like that. Maybe you have what are called artifacts from your dialogue. So you create a report, or you create social media content, or you involve a journalist who then writes like a reportage. Or another really great one is from the summer school we went to, they created a documentary of basically Serbs and Albanians who were living in Kosovo. And it's like an hour and a half documentary about the dialogue that they had. And so that documentary can be a way of getting other people to think about dialogue outside of the dialogue itself. So, or maybe in the case of South Africa, you had these informal dialogues that had like politicians, so that people can be like in the dialogue. And if there's some kind of breakthrough in the dialogue, these influential people can like go to the policymakers and talk about it and pitch those ideas. So these are all mechanisms of transfer. And again, you want to think about like what impact do you want to have on the community, and it doesn't always work, right? Like when we did our dialogue in Calgary, we were invited by the city to host it, so we already had the ear of the city. So this was already like fairly easy. So all the reports that we were doing were going directly to the municipal government. But the fruit of a dialogue doesn't have to just be a report. Like a dialogue can produce another dialogue that involves more influential people, or that involves not just influential people, but involves like the people who are impacted, right? Because maybe the people who are making the policies in government about early childhood education have never met, like, I don't know, like young moms from marginalized communities, and so bringing to get into a room together can really kind of like open up space to get something happening. So thinking about transfer is really, really important, if that's your goal. And that's like a whole topic for another time, but this is something that you can think about. Oh, okay, so there's some examples here. So like there's your dialogue, and maybe your transfer mechanism are participants. So maybe your participant is a politician who then speaks to their constituents. Or maybe your participant is a school teacher who embodies dialogue principles in their school, right? So this is where you want to think about very selective recruitment for your dialogue. Maybe you have a report that's published, or some kind of text, right? Maybe it's sent to policymakers, or maybe it's published in a news outlet, right? So you're trying to like spread the word about like what happened in your dialogue. That could also happen with social media content. So for example, at Let's Talk Ottawa, we have a Facebook page. Everyone should like or subscribe or whatever people do on Facebook. So we would share like some kind of content from our dialogue on our page. And maybe there's hope that's like something goes viral or something like proves resonant. So like this documentary about dialogue with the Serbs and the Albanians, like people are still watching that documentary like now, like especially in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war, because like it's not all it's not directly applicable, but like there's a lot of things that are like quite relevant. So creating like a really good piece of content can like continue to kind of pay off in that way. And then other things that you can do immediately after. So there's evaluation. Maybe you're going to have like some kind of form that people write, especially for donors. People might want to know like their subjective opinions of what the dialogue was like. But it doesn't just have to be something that's done only for something formal. Whenever we have our kitchen talks, we also have like or different kinds of events. We also have like a feedback form, and I'll also be sending you guys a feedback form after this workshop. But I'm going to show you what that looks like right now. So like I have just like a feedback form like this, and so like people, are you satisfied with like the with the session? What did you enjoy about the workshop? What are things like we changed or improved? And so this is the dialogue. It would be like, okay, so like what issues do you feel like were addressed well? What issues were not addressed well that like you wished were addressed? What other issues would you want to have like discussed at a dialogue? And so for people who are organizing, this is like really important because like especially uh, when people say that like I want to talk about XYZ in the future, then those are things that you can use as topics for your next dialogues. So for the Kitchen Talks project, we have a dialogue every single week. So we're always looking for ideas that are like relevant for the people who come to our events, right? Also, as a like on a more practical level, if people want to be involved in future dialogues, you can like give them a space to kind of put down their email. So after all of our dialogues that are online here, like through Let's Talk Ottawa or through Kitchen Talks, we like if people want, they can leave their emails and they can they can stay in touch. And then we're right at the end, so you guys are troopers. If there's extra material, so for example, after this, I'm going to be sending you guys like a handbook on dialogue facilitation for peace builders. If you want to kind of like learn more about this peace building style dialogue. And then just following up, thanking people for coming, you know, like maybe saying one or two things that was like nice. Also, if you don't get funding, like you can ask for donations, and which I'm going to be doing after this session. So it'll be like a good example of how to do that. But that's also something you can do like immediately after. And so dialogue is not hard to do. You don't need an organization. You don't need funding. All you need is social media to advertise. I used Eventbrite to manage the registrations, a space, whether online or you could do it in your backyard, and then some time. So like sometimes people are like, oh, like how do I facilitate a dialogue? I need to organize this. I need to do that. But like if you really want to, it's not hard. You know, it's just like I think it's hard to like get into the mind space to think, yes, I can do this for myself, and like to feel empowered in this way. So I hope that that this workshop helped kind of contribute to a feeling of empowerment. Again, it's a lot of information, and normally I like to speak for 1 hour, and then leave like an hour for exercise or for discussion. We've been speaking for well over an hour, for about an hour and 20 minutes. So for the next 15 minutes, we had time for questions and for discussion. And one of the questions I like to ask you guys is what kinds of dialogues would you like, could you see yourself facilitating, and with whom? Like with your community, online, with whoever comes? What issues are important to you that you want to create a space for discussion? So thank you very much. I don't think anyone left, which is a really good sign. Everyone is still here. And that is how to facilitate a dialogue. So if you guys can unmute yourselves now, we can have kind of open discussion. And yeah, what kind of dialogue do you wish you could facilitate, and what would that look like? Kind of taking from some of the stuff we've been talking about today. And if you don't want to be facilitating dialogue, if you just came here for fun, that's also good. But if this is something that you're thinking about, yeah, like what would be relevant or interesting for you?
And start.
Mhm.
Yeah, so actually, I like the format of kitchen talks, and in some sense, because I'm kind of like a doctoral student now in international development, right? And in our department, I find that there is no many activities for the graduate students per se in
Mhm.
terms of the building connections.
Mhm.
Because we do courses, like we have some kind of academic events, right? But something informal in terms of the just getting together and getting to know each other
Mhm.
better, nothing like that. So it would be interesting, for example, to create something like in that format, some kind of like a social activity in terms of
Mhm.
the getting to know better each other and what kind of concerns people have, because there are a lot of international students in my department, and sometimes it can be very hard for them in terms of adaptation to the new environment. They probably have some kind of issues. So it's I'm creating some kind of network,
Mhm.
like support network. But I think it would be interesting
Mhm.
to do something like that.
And this is important too, because I think maybe some of the examples that I used kind of skewed more towards like conflict, serious war, stuff like that. But like sometimes, yeah, like dialogue is for fun, and it's like a great way to like get to know each other. And it's also really great for like orientation activities and stuff. But Sean, who's here, he actually hosted and facilitated a dialogue with a friend of his. I think for their either graduate graduate school cohort, or I forget it was people in your program, I guess, right? So kind of like what Lena's talking about, you guys kind of already did, but within like the Israel-Palestinian context. So it was like a little more directed, not just for fun, but I think like that was that was something. How is it for you organizing your dialogue? Was it something that was difficult? Was it something that was easy to do? I don't know if you felt like you might be able to share like a couple of insights from your experience.
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much, Josh, for that. That was really, honestly learned a lot, very informative, and definitely gonna go back to the recording to take some of those insights away. But yeah, in our experience, it was, I guess it was a little different because it was a smaller target audience that we were focusing on. So there was about, I think, 100 or so students in our program, and we kind of just focused on them rather than the overall school cohort. And it made it a bit easier because we almost knew everybody who was attending, or actually we knew everybody who was attending. Most of them were part of our cohort. So I guess in terms of the overall facilitation and making sure it went smoothly, it it helped that that everybody in the audience was someone that we knew. So organizing and distributing, sending out the event information, that was pretty easy. We did that through the school, just through the general school email, the program email. And yeah, overall, we kind of made it very informal. So we didn't want to add too many constraints on the people. We want the participants to talk freely, but at the same time, we wanted to ensure that there wasn't anything that was crossing the line, or I guess participants weren't feeling threatened or didn't feel that they couldn't speak. So in that sense, yeah, we did have, I think my partner, if she was here, she was kind of the driving force of, laying a lot of the discussions, because the issue was kind of close to her heart. She's originally from Israel, and, she also feels very strongly about the plight of the Palestinian people. So it was, in that sense, we kind of had that lived experience kind of drive a lot of the conversation. So that helped in getting, very authentic input from participants. And I think just generally, it definitely went smoother than I had expected. Maybe because, full disclaimer that a lot of the participants weren't Israeli or Palestinian. So the discussion did not, I guess it wasn't that heated in the sense that it could have been if there were people from the communities actually there. Most of them were just students from the program who were interested in the conflict and who wanted to kind of participate or add to resolving it in some manner or whatever it is, whether it's through a petition or whether it is kind of like organizing some like just this platform on campus, just attending that. So they wanted to kind of add something in a positive way to the conflict. So yeah, that was kind of my experience overall. And yeah, we're looking to have our second session hopefully sometime this summer. And one of the things that we're focusing on now is media and how do we absorb what's in the media, from both sides of the conflict. So I'll definitely, if people are interested to see how that goes, I'll definitely be happy to share some insights from that.
Cool, thank you, Sean. Has anyone else had experiences with dialogue facilitation that they'd like to share, or maybe a dream of a process they'd like to facilitate? Rosalia.
Josh, by the way, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. I just wanted to ask you a question. What would you consider the difference between consultation and a facilitated dialogue? The reason why I'm asking you that question is because I've been in government for a long time, and in my previous roles, I was involved in consultations with minority groups with respect to language rights issues, but now I'm working more in conflict resolution in the workplace. So the approach is different. If we have a group intervention, that is, because it's a specific group, and we might be dealing with issues such as team building or, in a toxic work environment. But what would you consider the difference? Or is there in your explanations that can you give?
In terms of my understanding, I feel there's a pretty big difference. This is something that we kind of rubbed up against in our Calgary project, because we had like 3 tiers of dialogues in the Calgary project. First was the community dialogues that we had at the community centers that kind of like gave rise to the different themes of what people were kind of like feeling and working with. Then we had like the next tier was basically dialogues on those specific issues, where we would invite people who are like impacted by the issue, but also people who might have something to offer. And in cases where we invited people from the municipal government, sometimes they kind of slid into the mode of consultation, which in my understanding, and you have more experience with this, and so like I'd also be interested in hearing your take on it. But for me, a consultation is like almost like a one-way process, where like if I'm a representative of something, I'm here to listen to feedback from. So I'm like from the municipal, I'm from the government, and I want to hear from the community. But that's like, I'm not saying like what my fears are. I'm not saying what my, what I mean? I'm there in a role. I'm not there as necessarily as a person, and I'm there to listen. I'm not there to kind of also share my experience. And so this is something that we really need to prepare for when we included people from municipal government, because like very often they kind of slid into this consultation mode where they're just like listening and like taking notes, but also like, okay, like what's your experience like? Maybe what are your frustrations? Because we had one session where we were talking about frustrations with the city funding mechanism, and people just didn't realize like what the difficulties were for people on the city side of things, because the people from the city are more used to kind of just like listening, and so like there were some people that kind of came and they were just coming to complain almost, instead of like coming to exchange, and so like inviting people who are normally in a consultative role to also participate as like a dialogue participant, it can be like a big shift for them, but it opens a space of like exchange rather than this kind of one-way direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It actually makes I just, as you were explaining it, I going through some scenarios, some situations that I've actually lived, because I was on the consultation side, and it's exactly that. I had to listen, take notes, we did prepare questions. We even used, in one case, we used the methodology of, the talking stick, like sort of indigenous, because depending on the groups that we were consulting with, because I dealt also with indigenous affairs, I dealt with, depending on who our audience was, the approach varied, because you have to adapt also to your audience. But now, as a conflict resolution practitioner, I find exactly the role is very different. It's more dialogue, more exchange.
And a facilitator, it's like they don't necessarily have skin in the game. They might, but often they're trying to, like, the thing about a facilitator is they're trying to create space for others, and it's almost like next level up to kind of have a facilitator who's also kind of a participant. So you wear your facilitator hat, and you're very clear when you take your facilitator hat off. But with a consultation, especially when it's come with like government levels, there might not be as much flexibility, and maybe consultation is way more like appropriate than dialogue, because maybe if somebody is like impacted by a policy, they don't want to hear the story of the government. They're coming to tell their story, right?
That's right.
So again, like, this is something actually we didn't talk about at all, but a big question when it comes to like preparing for your dialogue is dialogue actually what we need? Because maybe there's something else that needs to happen, especially like when it's a hot topic issue. If like a community doesn't feel safe, maybe bringing them into a room with the people who don't make them feel safe isn't the right first step, right? So dialogue is a tool to be used in certain situations and not like used in every situation.
Exactly.
But that's fodder for another day. Mangalam. You're muted, sorry.
Thank you for the session. You reminded me some of the stuff that I learned in the past. So thank you for that. And I would like to have a dialogue with people who are difficult, people who interrupt, people who doesn't agree, who doesn't listen. So I would like to learn some questions or some way of having the dialogue continue. It doesn't stop with the person who is talking, but also to get the right responses and to have an amicable dialogue.
Probably one of the best resources that I know for this is a book called How to Have Impossible Conversations. I'm putting it into the chat. And it's probably the best collection of dialogue techniques for difficult conversations that I've seen. Like, there's lots of books about this kind of thing, but this is one that I really like, because it really kind of starts from the kind of techniques that we were talking about today, but then going into like how do you speak the moral language of the other side? Like, how do you kind of like enter into their worldview? And so there's lots of like different kind of there's a mastery that can happen when you do stuff long enough, and that helps you kind of engage with people who want to argue, but with the way that you do it, you can bring them into dialogue instead of argument. So maybe we have room for one more question of maybe like a question from the content, or maybe somebody sharing what's their dream for a dialogue that they'd like to do, and then we'll start wrapping up. Sabina.
Hi, yeah, I have a question. I was wondering if you could speak on the role of trust as a facilitator, and like tips to build trust for your event, and for people to feel comfortable to participate, particularly over topics that might elicit strong feelings and beliefs. And I think you spoke in your presentation about this a little bit earlier, in terms of making sure the goals of the dialogue are clear and setting expectations and a clear structure, but I'm just curious to hear your perspective of what you feel the role is, or I guess everyone in this group, what you feel the role is of trust in dialogue facilitation, and what tips you may have in building trust, particularly when you need to try to build trust with strangers and people you don't know before the event.
Yeah. Like the disaster that we had, like with the kitchen talks about colonialism, like this is something that really kind of like it's something that can disrupt trust, and it was because of the mismatched expectations. Like somebody wanted a safe space to talk about anti-colonialism, and other people wanted a space to talk about all of their opinions, some of which were not anti-colonial, right? And so like making sure that like the people understand what kind of space they're walking into is really important. Someone's going to feel safe and trust the space if they know that certain things won't be said. And other people are going to trust the space more if they know that things aren't going to be censored. So again, like that's kind of like step one. But for me, I think trust, when you have like something that's more like kitchen talk style, it's more about this like trust towards the structure and the format, like how you advertise the event, like things like this, like how you describe the structure. But when it comes to a dialogue that's kind of a bit more serious about like the conflict or working with conflict affected communities, then like I don't know, I feel like 80% of the actual dialogue work is basically recruitment. And like working with communities and like building relationships, because like the worst thing that can happen is like peace builders who like parachute into like a conflict affected like zone and just like doing the dialogue and like leaving. For me, like I have two kind of main spaces where I'm working in, like this kind of North American polarization, and also this kind of like Russian Ukrainian one. So right, like there's a lot of work that I was doing like involving COVID, and so there are a number of people that were really scared about COVID restrictions and were really scared of the government and felt really marginalized and felt really not listened to. And I might not agree with everything that they have to say, but there was a lot of like time spent in those relationships building trust, and to the point where people knew that if I invited them to a dialogue, it wasn't there to make them feel stupid. And so like right now, for example, I just did some research, and we're going to be like publishing an article soon about dialogue in the context of like COVID style like conflicts. And like even the academic world is seen as like more like liberal, like less conservative, less populist. And so like actually getting people's input for something like that can feel really scary. And so, for example, like before publication, sending it to populist or conservative like friends or colleagues and just being like, what do you feel about this? Like, what do you feel isn't being represented correctly? Like, I don't know, like all these different like ways of just like making people feel like they're part of a process and that their expertise and their views are like they actually matter and stuff like that. So like I think I don't know, there's so much to talk about with like trust, but like those are kind of maybe some recent examples for me. And then also like when I start doing something like kitchen talks, it's like I would invite people I knew and who knew me, and so I think that some people came just because they knew me and they felt that like they were happy to be in a space that I was facilitating. But when I was in St. Petersburg, we would often do dialogues in specific spaces. So like a charity shop or like an activist space. And so people's trust was like not so much like directed at me, but directed to the space where something was happening. And this is also the same in Calgary. So people trusted the community organizations that we organized the dialogues through. So yeah, it's a very multi kind of like faceted question. But for me, I think it's really important if you want to work with a specific community to like make inroads and like stay and like build relationships and yeah, not misrepresent them, I think. So we're a couple minutes over 9. It'll be 9 p.m. for you guys. It's 5 a.m. over here for me. I need to go to bed pretty soon. But I just wanted to thank you all for being here. Like I said before, at the end of every session, at the end of every workshop, I'd like to send a feedback sheet where you can talk about what you enjoyed about tonight's session, like what was good, like maybe some suggestions, what like other topics would you like to speak about in the future. There's also I know some of you left the donation for the event, like when you registered through Eventbrite. There's also an opportunity to leave a donation here at the end. It's not obligatory, but there's also information about that. And so I'm leaving a link in the chat right now. And so this is another thing that I do at the end of the dialogues. I send the link for feedback, and then we will have 5 minutes where we can open the link right now and start doing the feedback. Because if you send the feedback to people afterwards, some of them are never going to do it. So we will have 5 minutes right now where I'm going to ask you guys to open the link and fill out the feedback form. And then in 5 minutes, we will come back and we will close out the session. Are there any questions about the feedback? I used to put on some background music while people were filling it out, but then people said that they told me to stop doing that. So I don't do that anymore. Okay, so some of you folks are already finished. Maybe some of you are still going, and you can finish with the feedback after we close. I just wanted to have a few announcements. So first, this is our first Let's Talk Ottawa meeting in a while. Hopefully, maybe like once a month, we'll have something like this. I'm going to be back in Ottawa in July, and hopefully, we'll have space to do some dialogues and if people are looking to learn how to facilitate, like I'd be very happy to like co-facilitate like a session, kind of in the kitchen talk style. But also very interested in doing kind of like workshops and specific techniques or other piece building stuff. Some more to come. If you would like to be on the what do you call it? Like the email list for future events, and if you're not already on it, please leave your email in the feedback form. I'm going to be sending a follow-up email, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day, with also some resources. So a link to the book, How to Have Impossible Conversations. I'm gonna send the link to the slides as well, and also I'm gonna be sending a PDF, which is the like the kind of peace building handbook of like dialogue facilitation. It's just like 16 pages, but it's like got lots of ideas for like how to build your dialogue and different like exercises to do and stuff like that. So yeah, that is it for today. Thank you all for
I just
coming.
have one last question, Josh.
Yes, please.
How does tomorrow look?
Oh, for me?
No, for us, because aren't you ahead of us?
Oh, yes. It's dark. We like yesterday we kind of had like it was warm enough that I seriously considered like questioning my decision to wear pants instead of shorts. So I was like, oh, like actually it's like short season now. So maybe hopefully that'll be here tomorrow as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you all very much.
Very
Very
good.
happy to see you guys and to meet you.
Thank you, Josh.
And
Thanks so much.
yeah, we'll connect again.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Josh. Okay,
Sleep
bye.
well.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.